Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, alcohol, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Bite Size Balance. I'm here with my buddy, Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
How are you today?
How am I? Where was I today or how am I today?
No, I don't care where you are. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I just had a coaching session. Ooh. And I just had a nice coffee with a friend, and my kids have a PD day and they're old enough to look after themselves.
Amazing. This is one of the perks of teenagers. So Sarah's, you're going to have to pardon and excuse Sarah because she's distracted by the beauty of my hair today. She told me I look a little like Farrah Fawcett, which is very exciting. I'm going to tell you guys about this thing. I do not in any way have any affiliation with this product, but I bought this thing. Every once in a while I get dragged down the Instagram shopping hole, as I'm sure many of you guys do. I try to avoid it. My kids make fun of me. Last year I bought a pair of Birkenstocks. I'm putting that in air quotes for myself in my size, which is European 41. Like I knew exactly what size to get them in. And when they arrived, and I thought, oh, these are so cool. They're in this color that I've never seen before for Birkenstock. It was like this beautiful kind of light gray blue color. Ordered them, they showed up, and my husband has never let me live it down, nor have my children, because they were so small that I gave them to my mother, who has size like 6.5 feet. I have size 10 feet. And they were very clearly made in China and not actually Birkenstocks. Anyway, after that, I committed to not going down the Instagram rabbit hole again, but I had a tiny infraction, which I feel like paid off, which is I bought this contraption that looks hilarious. It's very simple. It comes from a company called Kitsch. I can't remember how to spell it. Kitsch maybe. And it is almost like a silk covered bendable rod, for lack of a better word. And then you basically just divide your hair in two, like you were going to make two ponytails down the side. And you just wrap your hair around that sucker. And then they give you two little scrunchies that you stick on the ends. And you can do it with dry hair, or you can do it with like damp hair and let it dry. You could wear it overnight. I haven't gone that far yet, but I used it this morning and Sarah is blown away at my results. Right, Sarah?
Spectacular. I can't wait to post some pictures of the two of us doing this whilst drinking alcohol-free gin and tonics.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So I'm going to get Sarah. My daughter does not listen to this podcast, so I'm not worried about spoiling anything for her, but I got her the same thing for Christmas. So I'll have an extra one, which means that because chances are she'll reject it and leave it here. So Sarah and I are planning on doing it together after Christmas. And she just said it. She's allowing me to post a selfie of us, which I don't know. She's pretty careful about what photos she lets me put out there on the internet. So we'll see. Anyway, today we're going to talk about raising teenagers, and wanted to just start by saying, clearly we're not parenting experts. We have no training or anything in this area, but we both have a lot of experience. My kids are now 18 and 19, and they're both in university, as many of you know. And Sarah's kids, Sarah, how old are your kids now?
They're about to be 13 and 15.
All right. So Sarah's got two teenagers. She's in it. I'm still in it. And we talk a lot about it. We go for walks, often together, and we talk about our kids, and we talk about, things that we're learning and that kind of thing. And we were out for a walk and talking about something. And I just thought we should do a podcast on these things that we've learned as parents that are actually, have been really helpful lessons for us and that might be helpful to other people. And just normalize some of the struggles that are involved naturally in parenting teenagers. So that's the aim of this podcast. It's not to give you any expert advice. It's just to talk through. We've made a list of some of the things that we think are were kind of revelatory for us that we've realized as we've been parenting teens. And some of my lessons I've shared with Sarah, and some of Sarah's lessons she's been able to share with me, and they've been helpful across both ways. And then, of course, my other kind of parenting person is my best friend, Megan, who will be on this podcast we're going to do an empty nester episode together because her last daughter left for school, first year university this fall. It is actually at Acadia University with my son. So she's now officially an empty nester too. And so we're going to talk about that. But she gives me all kinds of parenting advice because her kids are a little older. Her two older girls are, in second and fourth year university. They're ahead of my kids. And so I've gotten lots of tips and ideas from her too. And some of those are on this list. So before we get started, I have a little section of a piece that I've wrote ages ago about how nobody talks about the loneliness that is part of mothering. And it's a long piece. And I start at the very beginning and talk about babies and the loneliness that comes with, suddenly going from a really busy career to being at home with two babies. I'm not going to read all of it. I just thought I'd read the last couple of paragraphs where I talk about once your kids become high schoolers, and because that's what we're talking about today. And some of the reflections in these few paragraphs are some of the things that we're going to talk about more today. So I'll just do that really quickly, and then we'll get going. By high school, your teens have stopped talking to you. These miniature humans you've been mothering for 15 years are now 5'6" and 6'3" and think they don't need you anymore. They do. They get girlfriends and boyfriends and make junior varsity and start working at the grocery store on the weekends. They grunt good morning and shoot daggers when you ask who they're texting. They sleep until 1 and start to smell until they discover cologne and start to smell worse. They grow leg hair and chin hair, and there are now 2 razors on the vanity in their bathroom next to the overflowing dish of tiny elastics because you're spending more time at the orthodontist than the gym these days. While they don't talk much, when they do, it matters. You listen for nuances and tone, learn the new lingo, and download TikTok so you can keep up with their lives and those of their idols. You now look forward to the driving because it's in the car that she tells you that she can't sleep because of climate change. It's in the car that she tells you how it felt to not get invited to the party last weekend. It's in the car that he shares his anxiety about tryouts and his frustration with his chemistry teacher. It's in the car that you listen to his music and he lectures you about the cultural significance of Biggie Smalls. But most of the time, you're more alone than ever. You realize the hole in your days that was once mothering is growing bigger with every passing year. You find yourself sobbing in the shower at the thought of their leaving. How will you fill up all the empty corners when they go? What will happen to the still warm spaces they'll leave behind? You toughen up. You keep making yourself available, even though the not nows and the no thanks cut deep. You'll beg and bribe them if it comes to that, and it does. You keep a stash of chocolate-covered almonds to offer up on game night. If they stay for one more round, it's worth it. 9 times out of 10, they reject your advances. They've got cooler, younger people to hang with now. But that one time they say yes, you're ready. You'll drop work, skip the gym, even ditch your beloved book club for the chance to go shopping with her for shirts so tiny they could double as sports bras, or to listen to his running commentary as you watch the top 100 dunks of the decade for the 4th time this year. Their cruel words, casually tossed out in the heat of an argument, can level you. But you learn to wait it out because it's worth it. Eventually, they empty the dishwasher without prompting, offer you a glass of the blueberry smoothie they just made, drop an apology letter on your pillow, or the brass ring, flop down beside you on the couch, pull a blanket over their lap, and ask you what you're watching. And in those golden moments, you're no longer alone. So I wrote that when my kids were still living with me. And as you guys know, and Sarah, as you know, there was a lot of grief happening before they left. And I will say that sadness has left the building, which is great. Like that deep sadness that I felt when I was anticipating their leaving has left. And I feel I miss them, but it's not that same feeling of grief that I had then. And I've talked about that in some other episodes, but I just thought that those little paragraphs, when Sarah and I were talking, they came back to me and I remembered that I'd written those. And I thought those are really in line with some of the things that we're going to talk about today and how it feels to be the parent of a teenager, that the slow leaving. And actually that's the first thing I think we should talk about, Sarah, is that I'm pretty sure that it was your husband, Warren, who said this. And then you brought it to me and said, oh, this is what Warren says about this. And I found it so helpful because it's really connected to that slow leaving that happens. And that is that idea that in order to become who they're meant to be, our kids actually need to kill us off as the heroes in their own lives so they can become the hero of their life, right? So it happens for every parent. We have to get killed off. And you want to talk more about that? Because I know it was connected to like cruel words and, you know, the arguments that we have. And
it was connected to a time when a lot of energy was being focused on me as the bad guy. Like there were other things happening that actually had nothing to do with me, but the emotional response was being directed at me because I was perceived as the chief caregiver slash was intruder, really, in terms of like, you know, trying to be involved and trying to help the situation. And so it was the chief interferer. That's really right. What the perception was. And so a lot of the angst and rage was being targeted at me. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of, as Warren said, like death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
And it was excruciating. But when my husband is a storyteller, filmmaker, storyteller, and when he brought forward this idea that they had to actually kill us off, and I think in particular more the mother, really just kill off the mother in order to fully individuate, right? That they can't fully individuate until we are no longer the person. It's almost like cutting the umbilical cord, really, again. Mm-hmm. But it's a very slow, deliberate cutting of the umbilical cord. And I...
It's like they're using a nail file to do it. It's very painful and it takes forever.
Very like dull and and it but it's also, so they're doing it, but then they are also not fully doing it because, the other analogy that I come back to often in my own parenting relationship, and I see it all the time, and I talk to patients about it, is the metaphor of, when kids are learning how to swim, they come, there's the wall, and then they swim out a little bit, and then they come back to the wall, and then they swim out a little further, and then they come back to the wall, and then on they go until they're fully functioning swimmers. Mm-hmm. And that we are that wall. And what I see in my own life is sometimes that they're, out there swimming, and also, cutting the umbilical cord, to mix my metaphors, but then they come back to that wall, right? They come back to that safety. And it's kind of like living with teenagers is like living with an adult who's not very smart and a toddler at the same time, so there's this kind of like, they can make all sorts of like super powerful, amazing decisions for their lives. And they can seem really like mature, and you're amazed by them. And then 10 minutes later, they're like, sucking their thumbs and curling up on the couch, and they're, like kids again.
Yeah.
So it's, I got a lot of imagery in there for you. And I really found that to be so helpful. It was a couple of years ago, I think you said that to me, and I've never forgotten it. And I think it's such a great metaphor for what is happening. And it was just really helpful to me to think, whenever someone was being particularly cruel or shutting me out or refusing support or assistance on something that I felt very confident they did not actually have the knowledge or the resources to do themselves. That was really hard, especially if they were like mean, like I said. And this was just a really helpful thing to remind myself of. That, this is part of the process, and this isn't personal, which, if that's going to come up many times today, I think, as we're talking, this really remembering as the parent of teens that it is not personal. And that is so hard when your kids say really mean things to you. And listen, if you're listening to this podcast and your teenagers never say mean things to you, then this is probably not the episode for you. But so far, I have not met a parent of teenagers whose teen at some point has not kind of turned on them a bit. And that's what it feels like, because you have these kids who are, when they're little, for a lot of us as moms, we're the
we're the soother, we're the person they come to when, you know, they hurt and they just need a soft place to land. And it can feel like we're not that anymore in the teenage years. It felt like that to me a lot. In, you know, from the ages of like 13, I would say, to probably to 17 were the trickiest years, 4 years for me. And it feels like that, but that's not true. So I just want to say, as someone who now has an 18-and-a-half-year-old and a 19-year-old, you're still that for them. And, you know, this is one of the things we'll talk about on the empty nesting episode, I think, is just this, as Sarah knows, and as some of you maybe know, if you follow me on social, my daughter got mono this year in first semester of first year school, and she's in Ottawa, and we don't have any family there. We don't really have any people there. And it's been really, really hard because she's been very, very sick. And she's been back and forth. And I went out for a while and worked out there to try to support her for a few days. And I am 100% still that place for her. Yeah. And in fact, yeah, it stays that way.
Yeah, I definitely feel that, like that, despite the times, you know, which have been good and bad over the last couple of years, there's in those moments that they're sometimes few and far between, and sometimes they come like all lined up together, where I'm the swimming pool wall, I'm the soft place to land, and it's just like, okay, it grounds me again. It makes me think, okay, I am still this person who is trying desperately in the world to evolve, who's trying desperately to become their own person, and trying like all sorts of different things on, still sees me as their rock, still sees me as their foundation. And that's important to me. It's, you know, and there's a great book just on this idea of them individuating. There's a great book called Brainstorm by Dan Siegel. Did you ever read that?
No, you told me about it, and then I don't think I ever picked it up. But
there's a 2-hour YouTube video on Brainstorm where he's giving a talk at a school or somewhere. And it's absolutely fascinating, because he's a psychiatrist who totally dispels the myth that adolescence is a time of hostility and hormonal ups and downs, and that it's all negative. And his whole thing is about how the brain is actually pruning itself, so that we have these, and I've talked about that in other episodes, about how they have a lot of stuff in there, and they're like chopping away, trying to figure out who and what and where and what it's going to look like. And that's actually an incredibly vital part of what they're doing, but it can also be really dysregulating for them.
Right.
You know? Because it's taking the ground out from underneath them. And so we need to be that ground, and not taking things personally is a very important part of that, because in that chaos of trying to prune, they're also, I think, don't know what they're doing. They don't have to understand the impact that their words have. I think as adults, sometimes we don't understand the impact that our words have, but they don't necessarily, you know, when they say something mean, it may take them a while to figure out that it actually would mean, you know.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great thing to keep in mind as well through all of this. And we're not going to talk about the science and like the neuroscience of all of this, but their brains aren't fully formed yet, right? Like they're still developing. And so they don't have all of the adult capacity yet, and definitely none of the experience. So they have to figure this stuff out as they go. But I think that's a good place to start, is with this whole idea of like, this is not personal. This is part of, and like, think back to when you were a teenager. I mean, honestly, I was awful when I look back on it. I mean, I was just so nasty and awful. And, you know, I don't know how my mom put up with me. So I think it's important to remember that. And it doesn't last forever. If you're in that phase right now, it doesn't last forever. I promise you. And some of the other things we're going to talk about I think will help ensure that, some of the other things we've learned. So I guess the next thing that kind of comes from what we were, a little bit from what we were talking about, but mostly from what the little bit that I read there, which I wanted to talk about, And this is something that I think I remember having this conversation with you and saying, this is what it's going to be like, Sarah. And you really have to make yourself available whenever they want to be with you, because it's not going to be very often. And otherwise you're going to miss out on those things. And also you kind of have to do things that maybe are not the things that you would want to be doing, which is why I talked about going to the mall. I mean, I go to the mall all the time with my daughter. I don't particularly love the mall. Yeah. I enjoy shopping, but I don't love the mall per se. But I go with her. If she wants to go to the mall, I go to the mall with her, because that is the time we spend together. She values my opinion on things. She, probably values my wallet as well, but she she does value my wallet.
That's a given.
Yeah, the free Starbucks that she gets for me every time we go to the mall, and the things I get convinced into buying for her. But more, it's really just an opportunity for us to hang out for a few hours. She really likes shopping, and my son, same thing. Like, some of the things that I do with him are not things that I would necessarily choose to spend my time doing if it was just me. Definitely don't need to watch the top 100 dunks of the century anymore. But if he came home tomorrow and asked me to watch it with him, I'd sit on the couch and watch it with him again, because that is time that I get to spend with him. And for them, it's very pleasurable. And that's wonderful. But making yourself available is part of this. And I didn't realize that in the first couple years they were teenagers. It took me a couple years to realize, oh, hold on now. They're actually not going to want to do anything with me most of the time. And so I need to reprioritize here. Yeah. And I need to assume that most of the time I'm going to have the time to myself, and I'm going to do my self-care things and the things that make me happy then. But if they say they want to be with me, I'm going to try my best to make that happen, because soon they'll be gone.
That was really helpful for me. Because at the time, I think when you told me that, I was feeling stretched in terms of like the last thing in the world that I want to do is go and do blank, whatever it was.
Yeah.
For my son, it's like going to the Pokemon store geek gamers place. Like, there isn't even a chair to sit in while they oogle over Pokemon cards. And I'm thinking in my head, what a freaking waste of money. So I've had to develop a love for, or an interest in, at least in horror movies, because my kid wants to go to horror movies, and it's a way of engaging in a way that doesn't feel stressful for them. So it's not about going out for lunch and chatting. It's not about me asking questions. It's just time together where little bits of their lives just kind of filter in to yours. It's the same as driving, as you read in your thing, like, if you can get them staring straight ahead and not looking directly at you, or if you're driving a bunch of them and they're in the back seat of the car, I was like, the rule that I was told was never open your mouth. Basically, just like gather information. And that's also been really helpful.
Those are actually some of my favorite moments. Thanks for reminding me of that, when I was driving them with their friends. I love listening to the conversation, and I am lucky in that I think most of my kids' friends, like me. Like, I know a lot of my kids' friends, and our house was a place where kids regularly gathered. And so I could interject every once in a while with a comment or a question, and the conversation would not shut down. It would keep going. And that was really fun for me. And I would always volunteer to drive. Like, I loved driving kids home from dances or parties or anything, because they're all jacked up and excited, and I get to hear all the gossip, and it's super fun. And the last time I did that was prom, high school prom. I went and picked up my daughter and her boyfriend and drove them back to a party, and it was really fun. I actually was very purposefully extremely present for that, because I knew it might be the last time I did that. So yeah, I think it's important to just remember that being available for them is pretty critical, because the time that they want, it's going to be random when they want to be with you. It's not going to make sense all of the time. And all the things that you've come to count on as time that you spend with them, those things are going to start to disappear as they start to gain their independence. So that one's important. Now, I think the next thing we wanted to talk about was sort of the power of like the power that you have to not engage, which was just for me absolutely a game changer. And I may have talked about it in another context on this podcast before, but it's really very, very connected to my teens. This idea of learning that I don't have any control over anyone else or anything that happens, really, but I do have control over how I choose to respond and react to it. And I can consciously choose to respond and react in a way that will de-escalate things versus escalate things. And that is something I had to practice. I had to practice not flying off the handle. I had to practice taking a pause before I responded. That was my ability to do that was definitely strengthened by a few things, strengthened by quitting drinking, which gave me back my sanity, strengthened by practicing gratitude and doing some regular meditation or mindful exercises, because those all help me slow my brain down and just be more in the moment. But really what that's about for me is actually, I will actually say out loud to my children, I'm choosing not to engage right now. Let's come back to this later. And I will walk away. And yes, it is very annoying to them when they want to yell, but we've talked about it many times outside of the actual moment of escalation. We've talked about why I do that and whether that works. And they've agreed, yes, it does work. And in the case of my son, he actually this summer, I had to do it. We were on a trip and I had to do it. I had to leave a restaurant, which was like pretty high drama for me to do that. But I just knew I could just see where it was going. And I said, I'm not going to engage and I'm done my meal. So why don't you guys have dessert and I'll see you back at the place we were staying in. But when he came back, he had some time to think and, he came in and apologized and we had a conversation about it. And I reminded him that I was doing this on purpose. It was intentional and it wasn't because I didn't want to have conversations with him and that his thoughts didn't matter. It was that in those moments, the two of us are better served by taking a break and coming back to it. And he said, yeah, I've been really working on that. I don't know if you've noticed it. So wow. Yeah, he had actually he's very, very, and this is actually kind of leads into, I guess, another thing we were going to talk about, which is this idea of like, even if it feels like they're not listening and what you're talking about and teaching them and role modeling is not having an impact, it is having an impact. Yeah. There is very often, and this is something I think almost all parents of teenagers would agree with, there's very often a delay in the circumstances that give rise to the conversation and the suggestions around behavior change, what it means to be like a great human, those types of things. And then actually seeing that change play out. Often there's a very long lag between when I have that conversation and when I start to see that in actuality with them. And my son is so good at this. I mean, one of his great strengths is he's a very, very good communicator. And he is also very self-aware and insightful. And so it takes a while sometimes for him to metabolize, as you like to say, and incorporate whatever the conversation was we had. But he'll often say in a subsequent conversation, remember how we talked about this like last year or 2 years ago? Have you noticed I've been working on that? So, they do. And I know not all parents are going to get that from their kids. For example, I wouldn't get that from my daughter, but I do get it from my son. And I think that's kind of tied into this whole like not engaging right now and recognizing sometimes like a delay is not only helpful. The delay in the conversation is not only helpful to the two of you in your relationship, but that there might also be a delay in the changed behavior or the desired response that you're looking for. There might be a delay on that. Does that make sense? Or am I making no sense?
That totally makes sense. And there are actually a couple of other examples of not engaging that are important, I think, as well. Mm-hmm. One of them I read about in a book called I listened to my parents if they would just shut up, I think it's called.
Yeah.
I found that absolutely fascinating. And his point was, in terms of not engaging, if you have something like, say you're putting a limit on something, you're saying, no, you can't go to the party, whatever. Let's use that as an example. That if you're very clear and firm on that decision for yourself and you say no, then the conversation's over. And I think that that's has been one of the hardest things for me, is that like that the whining and the whys and the you're so blank and the, you know, all of the arguments that come around those kinds of decisions, they make me angry, and then they weaken my resolve, and then I'm questioning my own, you know, and you're going through your own stuff inside your head, and suddenly the whole thing is blown up, as opposed to like, if you're very clear about a decision, then that's what it is, and there's no more conversation about it at this moment. There can be conversation later, but right now, we're done. We're not engaging anymore.
I think on that point, interestingly, I have a different experience with that. So I think I can totally see how that's the case in many, many situations. And maybe it's like a child specific thing. I would say that one of the things that my son has taught me is that I'm often wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's been like the best lesson for me, because he is actually, another one of his very strong skills is he is a natural negotiator, and he's really good at it. And he's been good at it since he was like 5. So it is something that, you know, just, it's a strength that he has. Now, of course, like with any strength or skill, it can, you know, you can take it too far. And we have lots of arguments that come out of his attempts to negotiate when I've said no and he's negotiating. But also there have been many occasions where I've realized, actually, this rule doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's not the right boundary. It's not the right rule. And so I try not to be like, and I did in the early years for sure, but I've learned that with him, that I'm actually very risk averse as a parent. I'm risk averse as a human, so that doesn't surprise me. I'm a Virgo. I'm worried. I'm concerned about everything. And so I tend to take a harder line on a lot of stuff. I was also raised, I think, that way. And so I will take away freedoms because I'm afraid that something might happen.
Yeah.
And it's been very helpful for me to listen to his side of it. And it's hard. This is a hard thing to manage as a parent, because of course, as soon as he learns that if he negotiates, he often gets a different result, that leads to negotiation every single time. But it is a price I am willing to pay, because I would prefer to have to put the energy into that and the energy into enforcing a boundary, if it turns out it's still the right boundary, in order to ensure a higher likelihood that the right result is actually reached more often than not, if that makes sense. And so for me, that hard no piece has actually, because of my personality, I think, and how I parent, and the fact that I tend to over limit and over restrict, I think I've actually been served by not doing that as much. Does that make sense?
I think that's a really good point. And I think that the example, now that I'm listening to you, I realize that that's actually what's happened in our house too, is that I've become more open to hearing the conference, but I'm open to hearing negotiation as long as it's not hostile. Like
Totally.
I don't want to hear negotiation that's hostile. And so if you're going to present a hostile argument to me, I'm going to say no.
Yeah.
However, I did take from that there are times where I'm going to be sure. And it could be something simple like I'm not taking you to the mall or to whatever until you do this thing that I asked you to do 7 times already. Period. Like there's no negotiation here. And then to just walk away from that. So, but certainly with examples like parties or whatever, there's lots of room. Sometimes not lots of room, but there's room to negotiate. And then just back to my other thought around the not engaging is something that I started doing, and I talked about it, I think, on another podcast, which is when I feel that there's an energy in my house around the mood of the teens, whatever that might be, I now absent myself from that situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than sitting around and waiting for it to erupt into something or being on the receiving end of
Mm-hmm.
irritability or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
I will go for a walk. I will sit down and do a puzzle. I will like just take myself out. I'll go to my room and read. And so that's another way that I find it helpful not to engage, which is like, it's almost like preemptive not engaging. Like, I'm going to look after myself in this situation. And if they don't have anybody to take this irritability out on, it's probably going to fizzle out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
And you're also, the other thing that goes along with that, which is a little lesson that it took me a while to learn, is that this too shall pass every single time with teenagers. Like, they get into those moods, and it often is, like, as we've said already, and we'll say again, not personal at all. Like, it's something going on in their life, their head, with their friend, with their whatever teacher. It's actually not between you and them, but it's coming, you're getting the brunt of it because of course you're safe, right? You're not going to not love them anymore. And so they feel comfortable lashing out at you. But if you just wait it out, it will always pass. So for years I would engage. I'd be like, what's the matter? What's going on? Are you okay? And then I'd check back again, and and that's just irritating.
Yeah.
My daughter particularly finds that irritating, I'm sure. And it just oftentimes leads to her getting even more snappy with me.
Yeah.
And she'll say to me, sometimes she might say, like, I don't actually know what's wrong. I'm just in a bad mood. I'll be like, oh no, there must be a reason, and I just start pumping. I stopped doing that. Because what I learned is that she will always come out of those things. Obviously, she'll just work her way through it. If she really needs my help with something, and if it really is a big deal, then she usually will tell me.
Yeah.
Maybe not right away, but at some point. And if it doesn't pass, then obviously I'll go back and check in. But most of the time these things pass. She just needs time in a room by herself, or, to just a switch of physical circumstances, or go out with her friends and come back. And then all of a sudden everything's fine. Yeah. So that's been a good lesson too.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we're also trying to like manage that line between, like, I think you've said this too. Like, I did not grow up with parents my parents were fine, but they certainly weren't checking in on my emotional health from the time I turned 13 until I was in the house. Like, I don't think anybody asked me ever how I was. And I think that when I talk to other 50-year-old women, they're in the same position. Like, it just was not the culture at the time to care about whether your kids were emotionally distraught or not, about, whatever was happening in their lives. And so it's kind of swung into this awareness of teenagers' lives. And now we have to find the place where we actually pull back from that a little bit and just stop being over involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a real balancing game, trying to figure that out. I've always prided myself on not being a helicopter parent. And, but I will say, like, once they got into high school, that started to get harder for me, because I was worried. I was worried about what was happening at parties. I was worried about whether they were feeling pressured. I was worried about, oh gosh, so many things that come up in high school. And so I really had to dial that back. It was hard work. But I think it paid off. I feel pretty confident it was the right choice, because I do have great relationships with both my kids now. And I did all through high school, but it was different periods of time were obviously more challenging than others. So, okay. Be the bigger person. Neutral reactions go a long way. I think this was yours. You want to talk about that?
Well, I think in some ways we've covered it. No, maybe we haven't. Like, being the bigger person to me is like not letting my 12-year-old get involved, like my internal 12-year-old.
Your inner 12-year-old. Yeah.
And that's part of like not engaging, but it's a part of modeling too, which is just like, okay, we both fucked up here. Oh, excuse my language.
It's okay. I don't think anyone minds, Sarah.
No, you're right. We both said things. We both did things. I'm not going to wait for you to apologize to me. I'm going to come to the table with, what my experience of it was, maybe an apology, sort of just, I'm going to be the one to start this process of us repairing this situation, because I have the emotional skills to do that as an adult. And I'm not afraid that you're going to reject me forever, which is, I think, what children still are holding on to, which is, I made a mistake, she'll never love me again, right? It's pretty entrenched at that age, that still fear that you're not going to be there. And so trying to always be the person to say, okay, I'm sorry we had that misunderstanding, or I'm sorry I said this, I shouldn't have said this, always being the first person. And it's not always easy, because sometimes you're just mad. Yeah. And you just, or you're hurt, or your 12-year-old is saying, like, I can play this game. But actually, like, taking a step, obviously not engaging for a bit, and then always being the first person to come to the table with it, I think is really important. And I've witnessed lots of situations where that hasn't happened. And then it becomes, for the child, it becomes really insecure. And what you're also doing is you're modeling really good communicative behavior for the future.
And something you said there just struck me, which is not on our list, but I think it's something I've learned and something I talk to clients about, sometimes around parenting, but often in other contexts. And that is that anger is really misplaced fear 99% of the time. So stopping and asking myself what it is that's getting me angry here usually leads me to ask, what am I afraid of? And I had a bunch of fears when my kids were growing up in their teenage years. And one of the key core fears that I had was that whatever the behavior was that they were engaging in, the way they were showing up, the back talk, the anger, the whatever, or the actual physical behaviors that we were trying to work on changing or set boundaries around, I was worried that that's the way they would always be. That was like an underlying root fear that I had all the time. The other fear that I had, I think we all have it, is that we're never going to be close like we were before.
You'll lose them.
And you won't be close like you were before. You'll be close in a completely different way. Like they'll never want to, braid your hair and hang out with you for 400 hours at a time, and have you wipe their bum. Like we're not going back to that, but you won't be close. So I think those were my two big fears. But, to go to that, maybe we can go to that fear that the behavior was just going to be the way they always were, or this is now who my kid is. Oh my God, my kid is like a belligerent, irrational, uncompassionate human.
Yeah.
That would be terrifying for me. Or my kid is a vapor. We had a nickname for one of our children that was Darth Vapor for a very long time, because the constant vaping issues in middle school. And I was convinced this was the beginning of the end for him. Right? Oh, I just outed him. I guess everybody probably knew it was him, and he would laugh at this actually. But his Netflix name is Darth Vapor. Like, the Netflix accounts, that's his name. But that's a good example of something that behavior I thought, oh my gosh, this is a slippery slope. Like this is going, next thing he'll be, mainlining heroin or whatever. I don't even know if that's the correct term, but that was kind of where my brain went in that time. And so the anger that was coming out of me around all of this stuff was very fear-based. It was very much fear-based. And sometimes stopping and asking yourself, what am I afraid of here, is a helpful way to reset and to just shift the way you're responding. So that's just a little tip that I would throw out. Like when you're feeling anger, no matter what it is, whether we're talking, it's at your kids or it's about something or somebody else, what am I afraid of here? And that'll often it'll rationalize things a little bit for you in the moment. Anyway, needless to say, my son's awesome and my daughter's awesome. And
he's not a vapor either.
Yeah, he's certainly not Darth Vapor anymore. And that's actually a really good thing. I think it's one thing I can offer to parents who are going through this right now.
You just keep showing up for your kids, make yourself available, do your best, love them, try not to overreact and overrespond. Maybe use some of these things we're talking about today, and maybe that'll help you start to shift things a little better, because I want it to not only be better for your kids, I want it to be better for you. That's my main goal. I want you as the parent, as the mother, to have a better experience through the teenage years. And I will say that, like, a lot of these lessons I learned early on, and it really changed things for me. I really loved parenting high schoolers. And it was weird because we were, my kids were in grade 10 when COVID hit. So their entire high school experience was COVID. Thank goodness they were, in grade 10 when that happened, because they actually did end up, they were the first class to get a normal grad and prom, which was fabulous. But it was also a very weird few years for them. A lot of their activities got canceled. They were doing their driver's test during COVID. Like, it was all crazy. But I really loved parenting them through those years. So it doesn't need to be horrible. And that is not to say I didn't have lots of really hard times. I did as a parent, but mostly it was awesome. So, okay, that's enough about that. Talk about communicate by text about a fight or misunderstanding if they can't hear you in a face-to-face conversation. That was your tip, and I think it's a great one. Yeah.
Yeah. So before I had teenagers with texting, I would have been quite judgmental in my head about communicating with your child via text about these things. For sure, I would have thought that was really bad parenting.
Subpar.
Yeah, the joy of text.
Yeah.
And how useful. So my mother used to write letters. She'd stick them under my door. And it's usually like after 6 months of me being a total asshole, she'd just stick a letter under my door and just tell me how she was feeling about it all. And it would make me feel bad, and it would make me feel like I don't know, whatever it did. She was the consummate letter writer. And so I always thought, I'm not going to be that afraid to talk to my kids.
Yeah,
right? I was a force to be reckoned with, and I wouldn't have wanted to talk to me either. And so the fact that these kids have text now allows me to literally, if we've had an argument when we all left the house for the day, and by the time I get to work, I've settled down about it, and I'm like, can see a different perspective, or I can whatever, I can communicate that instantly, and it diffuses the whole situation. And I'm just loving it. And it doesn't mean that we haven't had meaningful exchange, right? Yeah. It's actually me being the bigger person often cases, and me, but also it not being like stewing all day. For me, more so, like, because they have short attention spans, often it's gone for them. But for me, I don't want to hang on to this all day. I feel like I've been able to like pass my olive branch through the world of texting and make things right. And it has changed my relationship with that whole medium, really. And if we need to, obviously for bigger things, we need to actually talk about them, we will. But I just find it diffuses all the potential little things that could become bigger.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's
even in the big ones, sometimes I'll be sitting downstairs and my angry teen will be upstairs, and I can't actually get near the door without being sworn at. Right. And so I will just, wait a little bit and then just put just a few words, I don't like a lot of words, just a few words down. And that usually takes the edge off of it. And so I'm loving that. I mean, you can also write a letter, but for me, the text, it's very quick. It's a medium they understand. They communicate in any ways. It just puts it in their sphere. Whether they choose to respond or not doesn't matter. I think
it's probably a kid by kid thing too. I'm thinking like texting does not work great with one of my children. It ends up oftentimes actually just making things worse. With the other one, it works better. But I did get this advice from a friend of mine whose kids are a little bit older. My friend Julie, shout out to Julie. One time I'd had, an epic blowout with a kid and was feeling very badly about how it had all gone and what I had said, and, all of the things that we feel after an argument. And just mostly feeling horrible that my kid was probably feeling horrible. And it had been a couple days. Anyway, I was out for lunch with Julie, or brunch or something with Julie, and she said that one of the things someone had told her when she had a similar type blowout with one of her daughters was to write a letter about all of the things that you love about your kid and leave it for them. And don't even reference the argument, any of it. And I've done that twice. And it has been really good. So I did it on that occasion. I wrote a list of my 10 favorite things about this particular kid. And that particular kid, it took a while. Again, the delay, right? I remember thinking like, I left that note 6 hours ago. I haven't heard a thing. Like there's been no acknowledgement of the note. There's been no, whatever. Like I put a lot of effort into writing that letter. There's been nothing. And then then the kid like left and came back with friends and left again. And I was like, geez, like I'm gonna get nothing from this. Like that's just gonna make me angrier, right? And when I went to bed that night, there was a envelope on my pillow addressed to Wendy, which made me laugh, not Mom. And the note that was inside was a lovely, lovely note. And it was basically talking about, it basically was like the response was very mature. And it was all of those things that you say are so great about me are the way that I am because I have you as my mother. Oh. And I was like, you can imagine, right? I mean, that's a keeper. I'll never recycle that letter. I've got it tucked away somewhere safe, but it was very meaningful to me because again, it was evidence that these things that I say and talk about, even though they don't always seem to be heard, are being heard. And also like, just because your kid behaves like a complete jerk does not mean your kid is a jerk. It's just a temporary jerk state and it will pass. And your kid is underneath it all. Your kid is amazing. And at some point you'll get to see that again. If you're struggling with this right now, I feel you. Like I was there for a long time where it did not feel very hopeful to me, but it does come around. So I think text, letter, little note card,
just the intention of like reassuring them that despite their behavior, despite your behavior, despite whatever the fight was about, despite whatever, that they're still loved because ultimately they're children and they still feel that insecurity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So like, it's just, even if you just send them a heart emoji, it just is enough to remind them that their behavior doesn't define them.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's just like a shot over the bow.
Yeah.
Hey, just a reminder, everything's okay. And sometimes that's what you need to diffuse it and be able to have, okay. The next thing, we've talked about how mistakes don't equal permanent traits.
Yes.
We've talked about innate. Oh no, we haven't really talked about that. Let's talk about parenting from Paris for a second, because this is something I think I've shared this with you. This is a coaching. This is kind of a cool thing that happened. It's, I had this experience being coached by another coach, and it's a tool that I use all the time in my coaching practice. And it's called, it's really just perspective shifting, or helping people see the problem through a different lens. And at this particular time, I was doing a coach certification or training, and we were in a practice coaching session. And my main issue at the time was that I had just had things were not good with my kid. And I just had a big blowout before I left for the certification. And I was just feeling very stressed out about my relationship with that child. And the coach took me through a perspective shifting exercise where we talked about where are you parenting from right now? Like, what's the current lens on parenting? What's the perspective on parenting? I was like, well, it just feels like it's hard all the time. And I'm just walking around on eggshells. I'm afraid I'm going to set somebody off at any moment, and it doesn't feel reliable. And it's just not fun. Mm-hmm. And so then the coach said, okay, well, tell me about a place that's fun. Mm-hmm. Like, where have you been with your kids where it's fun? And I said, started talking about Paris, because we've been to Paris a number of times, been lucky enough to be able to take our kids there a few times, and my kids really love it there. And we've had some really amazing times with our kids in Paris. And this is one of those places, like we are traveling. We always try to take the train there for a day, even, because it's like a special place for us. So I said, well, Paris is that place. And so then the coach got me to tell them all about like what it was like to be in Paris with my kids, and what parenting from Paris looks like. And, what's different about Paris from Hammonds Plains. So we called the original default perspective parenting from Hammonds Plains, because that's where we lived at the time. And then the other perspective was parenting from Paris. And, what I was asked, like, what's different about that when you're in Paris? How is parenting different? Like, what's different about your family dynamic? Well, time doesn't really matter. Everybody's having a great time. Kids aren't on their devices all the time. We're less worried about the schedule, and there aren't a lot of obligations and responsibilities. And I don't care as much. That was really important. Like, I just care a whole lot less when we're in Paris about all the small things. And it's way more fun. Mm-hmm. So I'm shortening this coaching session that probably took an hour down to like 5 minutes. But what we got to at the end was, okay, well, what happens if you start looking at the problem of parenting? Like, if you start just viewing that, consciously choosing to flip the lens on that all the time. So what would it be like if you could parent from Paris all the time? I was like, oh my God, that'd be such a relief. It'd be so much better if I was parenting from that mindset all the time. And so I consciously started working on doing that. And I actually had a reminder in my kitchen for a really long time to parent from Paris whenever possible, which meant choosing to care less, trying to have fun, stepping back from things, worrying less about the small things. And the reminder that was on my kitchen shelf was a picture of my son when he was a tiny baby with a big fat cheeks. And in front of it, I put a little tiny Eiffel Tower. And every time I came down in the morning to make coffee, I would see it, and it would give me it would ground me in a conscious decision to try to parent from Paris that day. And it sounds crazy, but boy, did it work. Mm-hmm. And I still do it. I'm like, parent Paris. Like, it's my keyword that just reminds me that lens serves me way better, because things don't escalate in the same way. I'm more likely to walk away. I'm more likely to say I'm not engaging, which is actually kind of funny, because it came full circle, that story I was telling about walking out of the restaurant. It was in Paris. Summer. It was this summer in Paris. And I just said, I'm not, and we didn't have a fight all week. There was no real disagreement about anything major. Like, again, I just cared a lot less, chose not to engage on all the little things. This particular thing was big. This conversation that started, and the things that were said were quite hurtful. And so I made that conscious decision to not engage and walk away. And it saved the trip. And then it actually led to this really wonderful conversation that I was talking about with my son when he came back to the apartment an hour or so later, and, had thought it through. And we had a really, really great, mature, very productive conversation about all of it. Very loving conversation. So shift your perspective if you're stuck. And this is just like a little coaching tool I can offer you guys, as like a group coaching thing. And soon Sarah's going to be able to do this too, because she's getting trained in all of this, in this same model around perspective shifting. But if you're feeling really down about where you are with parenting right now with your teenagers, come up with a metaphor for what that feels like. Does it feel like you're pushing a rock uphill? Does it feel like you're in quicksand, or you're stuck in mud, or, it's always raining, right? And then ask yourself what the opposite of that is. This is the simplest way to do that. What's the opposite of it's raining all the time and it's freezing cold? I'm on a beach in, Mexico. Okay. Mm-hmm. What does it look like to parent from a beach on Mexico? How are things different? How do I feel in Mexico? And how does that change the way I choose to respond to things? Mm-hmm. And, it is absolutely incredible how powerful shifting your perspective can be. Again, it's a new neural pathway, so you're going to have to practice it, because you're going to slip back into the old. I slip back into Hammonds Plains all the time. I still do sometimes, but the more you practice and remind yourself and correct your course and get back on that new neural pathway that serves you better, the more the more naturally your brain's going to do that for yourself. Yeah. So that was mine.
I have one that's not on the list that just
go for it. Go for it.
Which is that often I find in parenting, I spend a lot of time being the nag. Clean your room, brush your teeth. Still one of mine has to be reminded to brush your teeth. Do the dishes, pick up your backpacks, all the stuff, all this, you guys know it. Like nobody on this podcast is a stranger to it. I like to consciously remind myself to congratulate or appreciate the positives out loud. On a regular basis. And I fall well short of doing that. And then, I have a conversation or we do something like this and I'm like, oh yeah, there's a lot of little positives, just little positives. I come home from work and the kitchen is not a freaking disaster. Right. That, and sometimes, you can just be like, oh great, it's not a disaster. But if you actually say to them, thank you, the kitchen wasn't a disaster. How motivated are they going to be to do that again?
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
We forget those positives all the time because we're so wrapped up in what they're not doing. Yeah. Because they're not doing a lot, because they're teenagers, because they're lazy. Right? Yeah. They're not doing a lot. And so there's so easy to just focus on that. So it's a hard thing to remember, but I think there's a lot of value in just like, even every day, if you could think of one thing that they've done that's positive, just even the smallest thing, or I appreciate this about you.
Yeah, this really ties in with gratitude. If you haven't listened to the podcast, I did a solo episode on gratitude. It was many episodes ago. I can't remember if it was season 1 or season 2. It definitely wasn't season 3, which we're in right now. But there, if you search for the gratitude podcast, that'll give you everything you need to know about how to actually practice gratitude in a really effective way and what the science is behind that. But what you can do is, if you are practicing gratitude, you listen to that podcast maybe, or you've been doing it for a long time, you can, or you haven't, you can start it. But what you can do is you can specifically direct gratitude at your children for a month. So the nice thing about gratitude is that you can use it to target areas where you're feeling less resonant, less fulfilled, less content. And the way that you do that is, instead of just randomly choosing 3 things that you're grateful for as they happen over the course of the day, you're looking for them, you're seeking them out in a specific area. And I talked about on that gratitude podcast how my dad was dying that year. And I used gratitude. I really focused my gratitude in on the time I spent with my dad. And that was really powerful for me, because it took a situation that otherwise would have felt extremely miserable most of the time and brought a lot of joy into it. So you can do the same thing with your kids. Target the gratitude on them. What are some specific things today I'm grateful for with my kids? And this has been really a huge piece. I'm glad you raised it, because I've sort of forgotten about this, but big piece of why high school was so great is because I had started practicing gratitude when my kids were 13, 5 years ago, stopped drinking, started practicing gratitude, and started focusing on more mindfulness and slowing down meditation in my life. And I was noticing far more often the good stuff because of the gratitude practice. And I can still think of things. I remember one time sitting on the couch and my son was like 16 or 17, and he came up behind me and he played with my hair. And I thought, wow, this hasn't happened in years. This is a moment to mark. This is awesome. Tiny little thing. It lasted for like 3 seconds, right? Or I remember walking with my husband and my kids, and I looked up and my husband was holding hands with my son, probably the last time it'll ever happen. This was actually before that, but I did notice it. I'd say my son was probably more like 11 or 12 at that time, but it was kind of just a neat moment. Like things like that, you can incorporate and roll into your gratitude practice. And it makes a huge difference when you're noticing those things every day, the nice, kind, cool things. Like every time I get a text from my son, it says, "Hey, mama." And I think, how cool is it that my 19-year-old still calls me mama? M-O-M-M-A. That's how he spells it. And I just love it. He does it every time, right? Those things are really meaningful. So I love that, Sarah. That's great. I'm glad you raised that. We did want to talk about modeling good behaviors and habits and how that does pay off eventually. I think we've kind of talked about that, but also the physical habits, the things that you think, oh, they're not even noticing this. Like, why are they not eating any vegetables? Why are they, I know you were struggling with like the energy drinks. Why are they spending all their money on bloody energy drinks and not on, smoothies?
Ale.
Kale. Why aren't they buying kale? Eventually, trust me, this comes around. You know, my son sent me a picture, and he is by no means a perfect eater, but he is very into, like, as Sarah knows, health and nutrition. And he's a kinesiology student now at Acadia. And he sent me a picture of his dinner one night, and it was a piece of white fish and a huge salad. And then he had sweet potatoes and then, you know, something else. And he said, I'm really trying to, I can't remember what the message was, but dinner tonight, like I'm focusing on eating well. And it was so sweet because, you know, the teenage years where there were a lot of chips and pizza and all the other things teenagers eat. But I thought that was really, really cool. And then I said, oh, that looks so great, buddy. Good for you. That looks so healthy. And then he's like, I did eat 2 peanut butter sandwiches afterwards. So, you know,
well, he's a pretty big boy.
Baby steps. He's a huge kid. Yeah. Anyway, modeling those good behaviors and habits, it does eventually pay off. I always say when I'm working with clients, I always say, like, what you do, the decisions you make, and it's not just the things you do. Often it's the things you consciously choose to not do or say no to that have the biggest impact on your kids. And it's important to remember that your kids are not only watching what you do, they're watching what you don't do and what you say no to. And so for my busy moms who I work with all the time, like you do, I always say, like, what do you want you got a daughter, you got a son. What do you want them to think? What do you want their frame of reference to be about what it's like to be the female in the house, for example? Like, I don't want my daughter to think that as a woman, you need to do everything and take care of everybody all the time and not take care of your own needs. I think it's really important that my kids see me role modeling, saying no to things, not doing as much stuff, teaching them how to do their own shit. Frankly, like, teach your kids how to do their own laundry. My kids have been doing their laundry since they were quite young, and, you know, teach them to take care of themselves. And it's totally okay to say, I'm teaching you how to do this because I don't want to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because
yes.
I need some time back for myself. This is important for me, you know? So what we do does matter. And eventually you do see it starting to be reflected in the choices and the behavior that they're making. Mm-hmm. Do you want to deal with the trust in their innate wisdom, even when they seem really dumb? Which was yours? I paraphrased it, but that's kind of what you said.
I don't know. I'm just trying to make this short. Like, I'm often surprised at how wise my kids are and how intuitive and how in touch they are with their inner wisdom. In fact, more in touch with that wisdom than a lot of adults I know. And the thing is that they don't always know how to articulate it, and they don't know that that's what it is.
Right.
If you give it space for that to happen, mm-hmm. then and you can, you know, find a way to encourage that, they are actually incredibly wise about what their needs are and how social situations are taking place around them, and their awareness of what's actually happening.
Yeah.
I think you go from a time where they're young and you really think that they don't know what's happening around them, and it's bliss because they're really little, and so you can just, life happens around them. But when they hit these years, they're way more in tune. Their spidey senses are aware all the time of how people are behaving and what's happening. And I think that they actually have a lot to say about it. And that if you can help them tap into their feelings around it, that they have a lot of inner wisdom. And I think it's easy. And I've done it all the time, not all the time, but I've done it a lot and try. It's easy to kind of dismiss that that's there because they're still beings who are being formed, you know. Oh, they're not wise yet. Well, they actually are quite wise, and they surprise me constantly with how wise they are.
Right.
And so remembering that, I think, is helpful.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, you know, my friend Megan, who I will have on to talk about empty nesting, she said something to me a couple of years ago where our 2 families were on vacation, and we were talking about the teenagers who were all like, they're all just such great people. We've got 5 kids between us, and they're all just like unique and awesome. And I don't know exactly what we were talking about, but she said, you know, Wendy, we actually never had any control.
Mhm.
And it was for me, such like an epiphany for me when she explained what she meant by that, which is like, they were always going to be who they were going to be. And we spent, 15, 18 years, like with this false sense of control over that. Now, this is not to say that environment doesn't matter, and that, that parenting and nurturing and all of that doesn't, of course it matters, but your kids at their core have always been that person. And, I see that when I look now, like my son as a negotiator at 5, negotiating about something, whether he could, have his dessert before dinner or whatever. And now negotiating about something much, much bigger. He's always been that person. And my daughter has always been the person that she's been. And I've just been there along the ride, like for the ride, really, just to keep them safe and give them all the things they need and give them like a structure and a framework, to get through it. But they were always going to be who they were going to be. And that was actually a relief for me when she said that, because I was like, oh, phew, I can stop trying to turn them into something. Like, you can, that, again, like, obviously take this with a grain of salt, but I think it's really a helpful thing. And then the other thing I was thinking as you were chatting, that you and I have talked about so many times before really quickly, is that it's so important to remember that the way they behave with you is not the way they behave outside the home. And it's so, like, you'll see this if you start looking for it. You'll have parents say to you, oh my gosh, your child is so well behaved. I remember my daughter going to a birthday party when she was younger, and the mom calling me afterwards to say, I just wanted to call you to let you know how lovely your daughter was. Her and one other girl came and helped me clean up afterwards, and nobody else offered that. I was like, what? She never does that at our house. I'm blown away by it, and just even last couple of weeks ago when I was in Ottawa with her, she, I'm not booking her doctor's appointments or doing any of that for her anymore. She's a young adult. So she was calling the clinic to try to get an appointment. And I was just blown away at her maturity and how articulate she was. She was so well spoken. And I don't know why I was blown away. She's a fantastic kid, but it was so nice to see, like, to hear that, and just see that. And I constantly getting comments about how you say it to me all the time, like about my son, about how engaging he is with adults and how lovely and, confident and friendly and all of these things, and then, of course, many, many months where I felt like he was just, awful because the way he was talking to me, that's not the way they show up out there. So you're a safe place. They do all the bad stuff in front of you, you get the worst of it. And chances are they're not behaving that way outside of the home. Very last thing, let's close off with the fine line between a brain tumor and a cracker. Can we talk about that? So Sarah and I we're out for a walk the other night.
Your thing.
I'm very worried about my daughter. She's going to be fine, but I'm a mom and she's not here. And it's the hardest thing about empty nesting, which again, we'll talk about on the empty nest podcast, is that, you can't do anything to help them. And it's a really weird place to be. You go from like taking care of all the needs to just suddenly you can't. And anyway, she caught a flu on top of the mono and has just been so run down, and she's trying to go now. She's got finals and she's doing an amazing job of getting through all of this, but it's been tough. And I've been telling her, sleep all the time. Like, I've specifically been telling her to do this thing. And the other day I was trying to get in touch with her and she wasn't responding. And I went into full Virgo, like down the Virgo rabbit hole with the worry. And I had convinced myself that she'd had a seizure, or that maybe she had a brain tumor and she had, she was incapacitated in her single dorm room and nobody knew she was in there. And how was I going to know if she was going to be okay, because I didn't have her friends' phone numbers. There was no way for me to, anyway, I just went right down the rabbit hole. And then of course she texted me and said she'd been sleeping all day, which is what she should have been doing. And we had a conversation, and she just hadn't had enough to eat that day. And that was why she had described some symptoms to me the night before that had made me nervous. And I think they were largely related to blood sugar. But anyway, Sarah and I were out for a walk and I was telling her all of this. And she was like supporting me, but laughing a little bit. And at some point, one of us said, It's a fine line between a brain tumor and a cracker, which was really what she needed. She really just needed to eat some crackers. Her blood sugar had plummeted. But that's what it's like to parent teenagers. It's a lot of it's outside of your control. You're going to worry about stuff, but it's all going to be okay. And I think that's our wrap up.
I think we can wrap on the brain tumor and the cracker.
On the brain tumor and cracker analogy.
You're still going to worry. I mean, that's the bottom line. You're still going to worry.
You're still going to worry. And you
can't control any of it.
You really can't. I mean, you can consciously. I mean, I talked myself off of that ledge, and obviously I was going for a walk for you because that's good with you, because it's good for my mental health. And I knew I knew someone needed to take me down because I was in an unsustainable, ridiculous place with my worry. Anyway, thank you, Sarah. I hope that you guys listening found this to be helpful. Again, we're not experts, but we're in it, and I've been through a lot of it already. And so we thought that some of these things that we talk about on our walks together might be interesting to you guys. And I'd love to hear from you. So if you're listening and you have some thoughts or things that you've learned as a parent of a teenager, send them my way. Send me an email, DM me on social. Let me know. Oftentimes your comments become something Sarah and I talk about, and they lead to podcast episodes. So if you've got something you want us to talk about, or find an expert to talk to about, let us know. And thanks as always for listening. We really, really appreciate you guys. Bye, Sarah.
Bye.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. Ready to create a life you don't want to escape from? Download your free Blueprint for Change now. This incredible workbook includes some of my favorite coaching tools and will help you get clear on what you need more and less of in your life. Grab it at www.wendymccallum.com/blueprint. That's www.wendymccallum.com/blueprint.